My name is Nicole Beck, and my presentation is on permit requirements for permit required confined spaces. I'm going to define what a permit required confined space is and some examples of it, identify what is required on the confined space permit, the various types of permits needed for entry into a confined space, and what permit suspensions are. A confined space, by definition, according to the Occupational Health and Safety Administration, says that a confined space is a location that is large enough and configured in a way that an employee can bodily enter and perform assigned work, but has limited or restricted means for entry or exit, and is not designed for continuous employee occupancy. A permit required confined space must meet one or more of four characteristics. It must contain or have the potential to contain a hazardous atmosphere, contain a material that has the potential for engulfing an entrant, has an internal configuration that could trap or asphyxiate an entrant, contain any other recognized serious safety or health hazard. Some examples include boilers, storage tanks, furnaces, railroad tank cars, manholes, sewers, septic tanks, underground utility tunnels, ventilation and exhaust ducts, pits, and excavation areas. Many types of production equipment can also be considered. So, why do you need a permit? A permit serves many functions. It restricts entry to authorized personnel only. It ensures that communication occurs and that hazards are controlled. It also minimizes safety precautions, and it serves as an official written record of existing conditions, requirements, and safeguards. The permit must include the name of the permit space to be entered, date and authorized duration of entry, purpose of entry and the known space hazards, test results and the tester's initials or signature, measurements to be taken to isolate the permit space and to eliminate or control space hazards, and acceptable entry conditions. It must also require the name of authorized entrant or entrants, the name of eligible attendants, the name of individuals authorized to be entry supervisors, name and signature of the supervisor who authorizes entry, the name and telephone numbers of rescue and emergency services, including the means to be used to contact them. It also has to have communication procedures and equipment to maintain contact during entry. Any additional permits, such as hot work for welding or cutting, that have been issued authorizing work in the permit space. Special equipment and procedures for including PPE or personal protective equipment and any other information needed. As mentioned, a confined space permit must be signed by the entry supervisor, and it must be posted at all entrances of the space or be made available to the entrant prior to entering the space so they can verify pre-entry preparations were completed, and the entry duration must not exceed the time needed to complete the task. The attendant named on the confined space permit must receive an attendant permit prior to any work at the confined space. The attendant must be trained in the role and responsibilities. The attendant is responsible for maintaining communication with the entrant, notifying the emergency rescue team in an emergency, and conducting non-entry rescues. The attendant must also remain outside of the permit space during entry operations until they are relieved by another attendant. They must not perform any duties that might interfere with monitoring and protecting authorized entries, and they must maintain an accurate count of all persons in the space. They must know the hazards that may be faced during entry, including information on the signs or symptoms and the consequences of exposure. Be aware of possible behavioral effects of hazard exposure in authorized entrants, and recognize potential permit space hazards and monitor activities inside and outside the space to determine if it is safe for entrance. They must order entrants to evacuate the permit space when a prohibited condition exists. A worker shows behavioral signs of a hazard exposure. A situation outside the space exists that could endanger entrance. They detect an uncontrolled hazard within the permit space. The attendant cannot effectively and safely perform required duties. They must summon rescue and emergency services as soon as it is determined that authorized entrants need to escape from the permitted space due to hazards. They must perform any non-entry rescues as specified by the rescue procedure unless they are trained in emergency entry rescue procedures and are relieved by another attendant prior to entry. An entrant permit is for the person entering the confined space and is called the entrant, or they are called the entrant, and they must have a clear understanding of what they are responsible for. They must know the possible hazards and use any personal protective equipment deemed appropriate. They must maintain communication with the attendant, alerting them to any possible dangerous situation or condition that arises. They must be trained to determine acceptable entry conditions as well as recognize conditions when operations need to be terminated. They must be able to exit the space unassisted, safely, and quickly. They must be afforded the opportunity to observe and any testing or monitoring of the space prior to entry and during permitting. Permits can also be canceled. The entry supervisor cancels the work permit when the task has been completed. However, the permit can also be canceled when new conditions exist at the space or a work stoppage occurs. The conditions and reason for stoppage must be noted on the canceled permit and then used when revising the space permit. The employer must keep these for a year. A work stoppage indicates a major failure that could have serious consequences. Stoppages can be from immediate evacuations, such as unauthorized entry of personnel, external hazard that may have caused safety concerns inside the space or make enforcement of the work order difficult, introduction or development of new hazards inside the space, and rescue team is out to lunch. OSHA allows for a permit to be suspended instead of canceled and reissued if the condition inside or outside the permit space requires it to be evacuated, but the permit space becomes acceptable soon after. The permit would not need to be canceled and reissued. I hope you enjoyed my presentation. That is it, and these are my references.